this election, and that seems to be taking away from the traditional Democrat votes, particularly in some of these states, like Michigan, Florida, and some others. We will have, again, we'll have to wait and see how that pans out. But whether the questions on whether Republican, also like touching the question whether Republican or whether Democrat president would be better from India and from that perspective. I think if you look at the recent steps, the recent comments from the Democrat the nominee, they have, like Biden has certainly reached out and whether he's the other pitches. I think there's a little of but on the other side, the Republicans are of course not the same. But if you look at Biden's history, is there a positive history with India and that affect some of the vote shares or the vote share inside the US? He has some positive history. Largely, Biden is seen as a guy was behind Barack Obama, spent time with India, his campaign documents, lays out a lot of stress on India. As Vice President Obama in 2009 and 17, he was really the guy who was on the administration's policy agenda. This included a lot of things, prioritizing partnership with India, and his support extended after his time in the Senate, when he actually helped the National Movement 2008 US initiative. He played a pivotal role in his administration. So that really has one mix in terms of his reach out. He's also seen very favorable and closely with the members of the India Caucus in DC. So these are positive things for the Democrat nominee. Some, of course, India, like the current government in India, and overall the administration in the US, the trend that they are trying to shift, some of them are trying to shift to the Republican Party, I think is a signal that of the comfortability, the growing comfortability of facing Republicans. Largely, these rest of the domestic. So some of the bruises are, of course, the visa issues, recently the F1 and before the J1. Those issues will remain. Also, the unpredictability that comes with the Trump administration is something that may not be an election factor per se, but I think it is certainly into consideration in some of the sections of the Indian order. Now, I guess I'll stop there and probably take your questions if the Q&A.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for your insightful remarks on what is the current situation and current contours of Indian diaspora's inclination towards either of the parties. Next, we have Sylvia Mishra, and ma'am, I would request you to provide your opening remarks.
Hi, Vasu. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on. It's good to see you. So, I really appreciated the opening remarks provided by both Rakesh and Vivek. I think it does a really good job on providing a good lay of the land of the present US upcoming US elections. I would provide three broad points. First, I think it is important to take a step back and look from where we have come. The second important point is essentially discussing how this is essentially a pandemic election, and a lot of the policies are governed by the current situation in the United States. And third, talk about a little bit about the future, which essentially holds what are the implications for India and the future of India-US relations. So talking about where we've come from, if we look at moving to the United States. And since then, we almost have a 55 plus years of Indian diaspora living in the United States. But if you're looking at the first phase, the second phase, I would broadly bracket it around the 1980s, late 1980s and early 1990s. And we see an emergence of an Indian diaspora which is much more politically engaged than a diaspora which were not so much. And what happens when a diaspora becomes politically engaged is they essentially bolster their equities in the country. So that is what has happened in the last 3 to 4 decades in the United States, where the Indian diaspora has been able to, as rightly pointed out by Vivek and Nagesh, has been able to strengthen their equities through the caucuses, through campaign financing, and also through just the spread of the Indian culture and knowledge. Like during the 80s, 70s, and 80s, we have seen like a cultural revolution. So from that point to now, where we have the first Indian origin woman who is running for one of the highest offices in the United States, we have come a very long way. And there's a sense in the American society that Indian Americans feel a sense of representation, which has been growing in the last 2 decades. And from there on, like when we're talking about this upcoming presidential election, it is important to note that the massive job losses that has plagued the American economy, and a lot of policies by the Trump administration actually has been very reactive. But given that, like we've already spoken a bit about the fragmentation within also the Indian diaspora when it comes to political voting behavior in the United States. And then we see a marked change essentially during the 80s and 90s, and even for that matter, the early 2000s. The Indian diaspora over here in the United States has mostly been engaged in terms of what are the political equities and essentially how the labor laws are protected in the United States. And that, of course, goes to a lot of trade policies and immigration policies. But as in how Indians have grown in their businesses and all, we have seen a more number of Indians and folks in the Indian diaspora lean towards an Republican administration. So even if we started from a point where the Indian diaspora was more left-leaning and leftwards, over the last couple of decades, we have seen a more fractured kind of political behavior. And of course, that essentially came to the forefront with the election of Bobby Jindal to the U.S. Congress in 2004. And talking about that, it just seems that one point that needs to be really emphasized and underscored is the fact that the Indian government has successfully engaged two very different administrations. We don't even have to look back to the Bush administration, but just a comparative analysis of the Indian government's engagement of the Obama administration and the Trump administration, what really comes out is Indian government's ability to successfully manage bilateral relations with both the especially the Modi government, by successfully engaging the diaspora, which successive Congress government actually has failed to do so, in a way has been able to give agency to the Indian diaspora in the United States, and which is extremely important because when we look at certain critical issues, the Indian diaspora has played a pivotal role. For example, if you look at the 1998, India was under sanctions after the nuclear test, right? And it was the diaspora that played an extremely crucial role in terms of getting and mobilizing the Indian lobby and the Indian economic lobby over here to rescind the sanctions. And similarly, when it comes to like the sales of military hardware to Pakistan, so by giving the Indian diaspora a lot of agency in the United States, we have opened a whole different dimension of bolstering India-US partnership and bilateral cooperation, which I think is definitely an important aspect of the upcoming US election. And as rightly mentioned by the two previous speakers, notwithstanding the fragmentation, there is bipartisan support from both the parties in bettering bilateral ties. I'll stop there and have to take more questions.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, for highlighting out many important points of this discussion. One of them is being ability of Indian government to manage two extremely different government with very different policies and to manage strategic relations with both of them, and many other points. Next, I would like to request Ishani ma'am to provide her opening remarks at the roundtable discussion.
Hi everybody, and thank you for inviting me for this discussion. So I don't have much to say. I don't want to really say a lot for the opening comments. I think the discussion which follows will probably be more important. Just a couple of points which I wanted to highlight. That on the lead up to this election, we had the Indian Prime Minister's visit to the US and followed by President Trump's visit to India, all of which sort of gave a lot of visibility. And we do know that the Republicans, they launched a large outreach to the Indian American community soon after President Trump returned from the India visit. And now, of course, with the nomination of Kamala Harris, we have a very high-profile candidate who has who is of Indian origin. So, what we are seeing in this elections, which probably happened a little bit in the previous election also, but this time it's much more visible, is an outreach to the Hindu Americans. We've seen both the candidates reaching out to Hindu Americans. So one wonders whether that would lead to larger number of votes for any of the candidates, or whether that would actually lead to fragmentation among the Indian community. Because I have spoken to people of Sikh origin who feel that outreach to Hindu Americans doesn't really mean much to them, because they have other issues. They have issues of facing racism, which for them is far more important. But nevertheless, an outreach to the Hindu American community has become very important in this election. Other statistics from the Indian American Impact Fund, which is an advocacy group who support Indian American candidates, have shown us that there are about 1.3 million Indian American voters, and conventionally supported the Democratic candidate, but one doesn't know whether that there would be some change and some swing towards the Republicans this time, because Hillary Clinton had got a lot of support. Almost 80% of the Indian American votes probably went to her, and also there was a lot of funds raised for her by the community. So coming to funds, till perhaps the previous election, the Indian American seen more as the money bags who were raising funds for various candidates. It remains to be seen whether that is going to change in this election and the Indians would be considered as a community of voters to either candidate. And finally, talking about the Indians in the House of Representatives, there were four in the previous election, and in the last election, which was in 2018, the number remained the same, though there were 41 candidates who were sort of contesting, but not only for the House of Representatives, but at various different elections at the state level, district level, etc. But finally, only the four of them were re-elected, and who are commonly called the Samosa Caucus. Which again, I mean, if we look at Canada or the UK, we have much more high-profile people of Indian origin and high-profile rules. We haven't really seen that in the US yet, except the four representatives in the House of Representatives. So whether that is going to change also remains to be seen. Among the Indians who are there in the House of Representatives, we have seen Raja Krishnamurthy talking about immigration issues, which is important for the Indian community. Not the Indian Americans, but Indians who have been waiting there on long green card queues, etc. Whereas we have seen Pramila Jayapal and Rup Khanna, who have somewhat, spoken against the Indian government. So we don't really have a united or a unified voice raising any particular issues which may be important to either US-India relations or the Indian American community. So it remains to be seen whether even in the House of Representatives or at other levels, at state, district levels, there will be more Indians getting elected this time. So certain issues, and of course, some of my previous speakers mentioned not just Kamala Harris, but Nikki Haley too. We heard her at the Republican National Convention. She is also an important Indian American voice who will certainly make a difference to this election. So these are some of the issues that I wanted to highlight, and I would look forward to the discussion which we will have now.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So, after hearing upon the opening remarks, few of the issues which were highlighted, which I feel are of utmost importance, is particularly the personalities of Indian diaspora who are playing an important role. Be it Nikki Haley, Kamala Harris, or Bobby Jindal, along with the issues of immigration and visa which Indians are facing right now. The immigration issues which can be which could be an important thing in this election. So also I would like to highlight that not only in the realm of contesting elections, many Indian Americans are also participating in US politics by joining in the political party campaign, also joining in the campaign. Few of them are Iman and Sabrina Singh. These are some important personalities who are in the who are playing an important role in Biden's campaign. And then we have Sampat Shivangi and Harmit Kaur who are playing an important role in Trump's campaign. So now, since the floor is open for discussion, first I would like speakers to highlight on, especially Shani ma'am, to highlight upon the immigration issue and the visa issue which is going on, and what is its centrality to US elections. What would be its effect, or what would be the magnitude of its effect of this, what would be the magnitude of this issue on US elections and Indian diaspora?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and actually, in my opinion, the immigration and visa issues are very important subject for people in India, Indian companies, Indians who are stuck in the USA on really long green card queues, but it might actually not really have that much of a impact on the vote, on the people who vote, because they are the ones who already are citizens of the US, and they have diverse issues actually. Some of them run small businesses, so they are looking at economic issues, and of course, racism is an issue which impacts them. It is going to have quite a large impact on this election, as we know. So yes, though immigration is very important for Indians, for Indian corporates, and thousands of Indians in the US, but unfortunately, probably they are not too well represented. Though, like I mentioned, Raja Krishnamurthy is one person who has spoken about this. He has supported a bill. Though that bill was finally it was dumped at some point, but and probably changed. But that would have really, if that passed, that would have really helped Indians who are waiting for several years on green card queues. And then, of course, there's the H-1B issue, and President Trump's campaign, even in the previous election, was one of the central themes was jobs for Americans, and so several things that his administration has done have actually not helped Indians, highly skilled Indians, Indian companies who have people based in the US. So yes, though immigration is important for us, it may not really be important in the US election. That's what I think.
Any of the speakers who would want to further highlight on this issue?
I can add a little bit. I think I would agree with Nishani. The issue on the issue of visa, I think the Trump administration has been really unforgiving, but as it was highlighted, it doesn't really concern many of the voters on ground. And the larger implications of it's mostly an outside concern of the Indian government and many of its people there. But would it really be an important voting concern is something that remains to be seen. Now, that has to be looked in the context of Trump's relationship with India. It's largely based on quid pro quo. To that extent, I think Biden would be favorable. But again, it's not one issue. There's a host of issues. On issues of H-1B and issues of racism, as it was said, status of F-1 and J-1, the stand of Trump administration is very clear. India would probably prefer on these issues, or the Indian Americans prefer Biden on these issues. But the voting patterns are very different than media expectations, at least. So I would say that it doesn't really concern the ground in the manner that we sort of extrapolate now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Carry on the discussion. Take the discussion forward. There was during the opening remarks, there was a mention about Hindu Americans and about the fragmentation of Indian diaspora, because during this election campaign we have seen different groups like Hindus for Trump, Sikhs for Trump, and Muslims for Trump. And what these groups imply, what does this fragmentation of Indian diaspora imply in these elections?
but still, I think that standing experiment, not citing some of the issues, as equally as the Democratic Party members have, finding themselves, struggling to be justice. I think that is something somewhere.
Can I come here? Yeah, sure, sir. Please. Yeah, so just to kick off from where Dr. Vivek left, I think the point was well made by each of the co-panelists that when you look at India and Indian Americans and what their expectations are in the electoral process, even though each of the denominations of Indian Americans we have would have issues of their own, these are largely localized issues. I think ultimately when it comes to a presidential cycle in the context of India, given Prime Minister Modi's very personalized style of diplomacy and the way he has engaged with the diaspora in the US, a predominant section of the Indian Americans seem to have bought into this notion that what matters for them is which of these candidates is going to help or enable the rise of this Naya Bharat, which Prime Minister Modi has talked about. So the point is, even though they may have local wants, local grouses on many issues ranging from their own H1B issues to local racism issues, it ultimately boils down to is Trump better and his unhinged presidential style better? Or should we be going back to the predictability of an institutional approach that normally democratic presidents bring into office? In that case, I think what's going to happen is that the Modi, in fact, I just want to bring up an issue here that Honorable Mr. Jaishankar, when he was recently asked about the nomination of Kamala Harris and the role that Indian Americans could play and the both political parties, he chose to use a different word, bipartisan. He actually said non-partisan. And this is a view that probably even US impact has been using, where they like to basically talk about the whole issue of relations with India, strategic relations with India, having become non-partisan. I think many Indians still remember, those who are associated with foreign policy, still remember the first term of the Clinton administration when you had a lady like Robin Raphael, and how she would actually, in a very vitiating way, affect the Clinton presidency's Kashmir policy. I think the worries do remain at times that probably in a democratic administration, if you have something of that kind of an appointment in a crucial points-person role, that this would actually lead to a certain undermining of the momentum in India-US relations. So coming back to the point, most Indian Americans are still willing to look at the larger picture of who's really going to assist the rise of a strong India. And this is where I feel Joe Biden made that very important comment when he seemed to indicate that on the issue between India and China, US would be on the side of India. Because they quite clearly understand right now that what matters for Indians right now is the border conflict with China. And they wanted to hear a message like that, a resounding message like that from President Biden, from Vice President Biden, saying that President Biden would strongly stand by India on the issue with China. So I think these issues need to be looked at in more detail, rather than the more localized issues which don't necessarily figure at the level of electoral considerations.
Thank you very much, sir. Indeed, this leads up to the point of strategic convergence about how, when we are talking about larger picture, a convergence between India and USA would be important for the diaspora there. Taking further the discussion, I would request the speakers to either highlight in brief about what were the reasons behind the diaspora's transforming lineation from Democrats to Republicans, as it was mentioned, in the opening remarks. I would request speakers to highlight what were the basic reasons or what were the tenets for this transformation of lineage. As you all know, one of the reasons is about how about due to the personal relationship between Modi and Trump, and events such as Modi and the subsequent event which was taken place in India. I would like to ask speakers, are there any other reasons which led to transformation of this lineage from elected party towards the independence?
Anyone else wants to go? Go ahead. Okay, so I just want to make a couple of points here. I think the transition pivot moment really began
But somehow, because Prime Minister Modi also has a very personalized style of diplomacy, I think probably he's begun to like this engagement with Trump. Because while Trump may be unpredictable, he's somebody, as Dr. Vivek said, he's somebody who is like a quid pro quo. You can actually do business with him. As we speak, we hear from our Commerce Minister that a limited phase one trade deal has already been agreed upon. And he even said that the timing is left to the Americans. So if you want to do a deal, it's doable. With the Democrats, the problem that I think many Indians will face is that you don't know what to expect. Although there is a certain predictability, there could be a lot of nagging that could go on various issues which could come in the way of strategic initiatives. So I would say rather than looking at the Modi-Trump phenomenon as being the pivot moment, it really was the 8 years of the Bush administration in which they were actually able to also solicit Democratic support, which then obviously carry forward what Bush had initiated to be able to build a strong bedrock for India in West. So it would be my contention that we actually see the pivot moment with the Bush administration, and Trump has only kind of given it a leg up.
Thank you, sir, for your remarks and comments. Certainly, it has cleared that what were the major transition moments. Would not request Abhivardhan to join in and provide his remarks on the in the discussion. Abhivardhan? Okay, I guess before that, I would request our research members Manohar Samal or Mugdha Satpute to provide their remarks or to ask their remarks and ask the questions to the speakers. Manohar and Mugdha, over to you.
Yes. So good evening, everybody. I actually have a few open questions which any of the panelists can answer. Uh, First is, would it be correct to presume that Republicans are tapping on the Judeo-Christian view of the United States, which was put forth by the Jefferson and Washington administration? Or would it be correct to presume that they are more focused upon controlling the evangelic Christian populace? And how would this, Christian-centric political strategy affect the American Indians after the elections are over?
Manohar, the question was directed to any
It's
particular.
open. It's open.
It's
Any
open.
of the panelists. Yes.
Yeah. So, could you just repeat your question once again?
Certainly. It's actually of recent perception that there has been the Republicans are trying to use a very Christian-centric political strategy by using a certain populists to get their agenda out. So how would this affect the American Indians in the long run?
If I may, I think broadly, yes, they're using a very Christian-centric because they are a predominantly Christian country. But I think if you've seen some of the trends starting with Bush administration, as it was said by Dr. Kartweka, especially under Obama, you had seen a lot of secularization. Whether it was, but I think there was, and you see also some of these trends being embraced by the Trump administration now. Like I mentioned, the naturalization ceremony inside White House, etc. Trump's embrace of the Christians voters is quite there to see. But I think that it goes beyond that. It also caters to some of these other, because of the increasing diversity of the electoral vote bank. I think there has been I think it would be fair to say that it has expanded beyond, for obvious reasons, beyond the conservative Christian vote bank only. Thank you.
I can jump in on that briefly. So the point that you're making, yes, right. Most of the times during presidential elections, the concept of religiosity is often invoked. But then this is not new for this upcoming election, and it has been the case for all elections in the United States. So I would take a step back and say that this was a predominant issue also during 2016 election. What has really amplified or probably accentuated the like fissures between like Catholic Christians and Protestants is the recent spin-off and like the high power tension in Washington D.C. and elsewhere in the country due to the Black Lives movement. And it really came to the forefront when President Trump went in front of the national cathedral and did uphold a Bible. So in a way, he was trying to city in the conversation of Black Lives Movement, but essentially, I do not think that it impacts the Indian American or the Indian diaspora in the United States. And if anything, I think there's essentially a pushback in terms of like invoking too much of a religion in the conversation. We've heard like several senior spokesperson in the super PACs in of the India caucuses mentioned that most of the Indian Americans and overseas Indians follow essentially a policy which is more liberal and more progressive, and they do not in the upcoming US election. So I would say that it is more of a spin-off of the Black movement, something extremely new that we are seeing. I'll stop there.
I would also like to add something here. I mean, as far as the wooing the Christian vote, because I don't think it has much of an impact on the Indian American vote per se. But on the other hand, this reaching out to the Hindu group seems to be something which will probably have an impact. Because earlier this week, we saw even the Biden campaign reaching out. They released a video where Hindu Americans for Biden, I think that's the name of the group, where they try to sort of say that the Hindu vote is progressive and there's a true Hindu, etc. I mean, and then we had seen earlier Tulsi Gabbard, who is not of Indian origin, but she's a Hindu, and she sort of took her oath on the Bhagavad Gita. She, of course, dropped out of the race, but she also highlighted this aspect of reaching out to a particular segment, which is the Hindus. So I think that might have a bigger impact as far as the Indian American vote is concerned.
Sure, sir. Please go.
Yeah. So I just want to make 2-3 points here. Firstly, the fact is faith remains a kind of a concomitant in American society, particularly when it comes to electoral cycles. I mean, the very fact that candidates need to emblazon the credentials of being a true Christian on their sleeve, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat, we've seen this across presidents. With the Modi government, you've seen some running feud that the Modi government has had in terms of cracking down hard on some of the Christian right NGOs who are believed to be undercover, engaging in certain activities which the government of India considers goes against the basic spirit of India's constitution. But we should also remember that this particular Judeo-Christian segment cuts both ways, because when the Indian government under Prime Minister Vajpayee began to try and really entrench themselves with the Americans, it was the Jewish lobbies and the Christian lobbies who actually helped through APAC. They helped the Vajpayee government actually build bridges with the Bush administration to be able to see that there was some kind of a strong India-US compact that was being shaped. So just as this can come in the way of some of the Hindu nationalist agenda that the BJP may have in India, it also becomes a huge opportunity for the BJP government and for the Modi government to be able to use in terms of gelling with the existing regime. Also, we have to keep in mind that faith has been such a big issue. I mean, just now, Ishani ji spoke about Tulsi Gabar and the whole issue of the subtext of she being a kind of a Hindu. The point remains, just look at Bobby Jindal. I mean, Bobby Jindal himself is a professed Catholic. And he, in fact, went on record to say, I broke away against the wishes of my family because when my family did not want me to change my faith, I made it very clear to them if I want to survive in American politics and be a governor in a state like Louisiana, which is in the southern Bible Belt, I have to be a Christian. I cannot not be a Christian and be able to rise in the Republican Party. Having said that, there are many factions within both these political parties, like you see various streams in various political parties. So let's not look at the Republican Party as a kind of a homogeneous monolith. It has various sections. You have the Trump, kind of Republicans now. You have the Never Say Republicans. You have the Bush Republicans. You have the Reagan Republicans. So there are various streams of Republican parties which are able to attract various aspects of this religious faith to be able to express. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Should I go on?
Yeah, go on. Yeah, go on.
Thank you. I would like to ask two questions. It means those are open questions. As discussed earlier, we can say that India's identity politics has now become a part of the US elections and politics. So they are actually targeting the Indian American community based on different factors, but taking into consideration the agenda and narrative of each party and the domestic narrative of US citizens, including the Indian American citizens, means it may create a paradox. So, and these components will be determining the future relations of US with India. But while considering US's global position in the world affairs, it might seem that it is neglecting the other important matters of communities. So, how will the US's domestic, political, and diplomatic behavior affect its relations with other countries, including India? So, should I ask the second question now or afterwards?
So, I guess you can combine both the questions and then we can see which speaker would like to answer.
Okay. Uh, yeah. So, with the increasing focus of both the parties on the Indian diaspora, uh, the participation of Indian Americans in the government and US politics is also increasing. But along the way, I think that certain important points which are contradictory may seem to be ignored or neglected by the parties or the citizens itself. Means, as I discussed earlier, means certain policies or decisions made by Trump government are pro-India, but in means on the other side we can say that H1B visa uh, he has means attacked Indians that they have taken the American jobs. So that is a one side, and the other side we can say that Kamala Harris is seen as a the representative of Indian origins and means a person of color who will represent the Americans. But on the other side, she has criticized the Indian Modi government, and she has criticized the Kashmir issue, CAA, means all those developments which have been happening recently in India. So, what can be the determining factors behind this sorry, um, ignorance, we can say, and what will be its implications on the US-India relations and participation of Indian Americans in the US politics and government in the near future? Thank you.
If I can just start, I think on the contrary, instead of calling it ignorance, I think it would be astute politics. It doesn't really concern the international like bilateral relations. Even U.S. has been a beacon in terms of leading democracy, but even there, the international politics matter, but domestic concerns obviously overwhelm the electoral concerns. So I would say, in terms of in terms of the criticism and other line that Democratic candidates like Kamala Harris or Biden, etc., have taken, I think has been on the mandates of the Democratic Party and some of the predictability that has been there associated with the Democratic Party, as it was highlighted by Dr. Parulekar. And I think Trump has been a disruption, and in some ways a welcome disruption to that effect. And the personal chemistry, as it was highlighted, is certainly has taken India-U.S. relations to another level. Although the basing or the base of which had been prepared a long time ago. But I think in terms of the Democratic Party criticizing certain aspects, certain decisions of India which impact internationally, I think on issues of international relations, on issues of human rights, etc., you would expect that kind of predictability from the Democratic Party. But Trump, I think, on the contrary, has been very astute, very smart in eschewing these issues and maintaining the kind of relationship that he has with the Modi government. Thank you.
Yeah, I would jump in and agree with Vivek when he talks about a more issue-based approach the Democrats have towards Indian policies. I think it's fair when the Democrats do talk about human rights issues, as in we do, and like the Indian government has been trying to also bring into sharper focus what like the Uyghur Muslims that are subjected to a lot of some of these aspects of non-proliferation or human rights, but that is not necessarily I would say a negative issue because then the US is also holding similar standards to other countries, especially China, which is and has a very problematic policy towards the Uyghur Muslims, and the Indian government has been trying to bring it into a sharper focus. And talking about the Trump administration, and if there is a re-election and Trump 2.0, we have to understand and acknowledge the fact that the Trump administration actually has played a important role in institutionalizing a certain degree of continuity when it comes to bolstering the India-US defense and security cooperation. As in, we've seen like the 2+2 dialogue has been institutionalized. There's been hotline constituted between the two NSAs. Several defense agreements have been signed, like the Comcasa and also defense industrial agreements, which essentially incentivizes co-production and co-development of certain key technologies, especially emerging technologies, is extremely essential. So I believe that both the successive US administration, the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and I'm sure like there would be a certain degree of continuity even with the upcoming administration about how to approach India with a more issue-based manner. And of course, there are certain thorny issues, and we have not gotten to speak about many of them, especially India and US's trade negotiations at the WTO and several other IPR thorny issues. But then not always India and the United States have to agree. And like I think both the countries have been able to develop a modicum and a framework of understanding how to engage on differences. Saying that, one thing which I feel is going to be detrimental in the larger context of the India-US bilateral ties is if there is a greater fragmentation within the Indian society, and especially on very inflammatory issues like the Citizenship Amendment Act. So some of those kind of issues is something that India has to manage if it wants to keep on building better ties with the United States, and if it wants to wield the kind of soft power that India already wields. Some of India's essentially political and domestic harmony needs to be retained in terms of India accelerating and accentuating its bilateral ties with the United States. I'll stop there.
Hello. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of points here to follow up on what Sylvia said. The first really is that I don't think we should get over perturbed by what Kamala Harris has had to say, because at the end of the day, she's only going to be vice president. And we understand in the American political system that the vice president essentially derives its mandate from the president. What we have here in terms of a potential President Biden is arguably one of the most seasoned candidates to be president of America if he does become president. And in that sense, there is a great reason to believe that he will drive foreign policy. And obviously, his foreign policy, given his wide ranging experience, will be driven by the context of the strategic circumstances that confront the United States today. For example, let's look at the nuclear issue. Sylvia was so right when she talked about how the Democratic Party and Democratic administrations have pushed India to the wall in terms of pushing them to sign the NPT. But I guess if you look at it now, where this whole NPT debate has reached as we come to 2020, I think there are two important milestones that we have kind of traversed. One, consolidate and be able to actually beat Trump. So some of these also have to be seen in the context of rhetorical flourish, which when you get into trappings of power, you may not necessarily pursue them. Because remember one thing, in fact, it's quite likely that maybe Susan Rice could be the incoming Secretary of State in a potential Biden administration. And she's somebody who had a fantastic personal relationship with our External Affairs Minister Jaishankar when he was our ambassador in Washington. In fact, Obama coming here for the Republic Day as a chief guest was something that was struck on background when Jaishankar actually engaged her in the early days of the Modi administration. So I think there could be a lot that we could work with, even with a potential Biden presidency. And I don't think we need to get necessarily worked up by certain comments of a potentially incoming vice president. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Abhivardhan, would you like to join in?
Sure. So, greetings to all. I would just make very simple views on what have we discussed so far. And I think we are also nearing the end of the discussion. So, one interesting thing which we can actually find from the US presidential election is that for a long time, whether it is the Democrats, whether it is the Republicans, it has been a status quo presidency. I think we have discussed this part very early. What Donald Trump has specifically done, and I think all the people who follow Donald Trump, his administration, the people who left but still support, some people who were members in the Bush administration, now they are not. They actually have realized that what is the Trump imagery is related to a kind of disruption of the US foreign policy. It's a very basic thing which we know. Now, since we understand that this is a pandemic election, and yes, the Indo-US ties are, always in growth, but considering the fact that the Democrats also have their own problems and concerns, my simple take would be on this that it completely rests on how people vote. Although there is one more aspect that there's something called a silent majority, and also where one issue which many people I think consider is that both the parties, whether the Democrats or the Republicans, require some propensity to drive a future for the US foreign policy. It simply means that you can't just wage wars, you can't just utilize the United Nations for multilateral achievements, but not translating into regional and national avenues. And I think that was the issue with the Clinton presidency, the Bush presidency, and the Obama presidency, which this president has, in my opinion, not actually done. He has actually used his own bilateral and unilateral measures to bring some solutions. For example, the Bahrain-Israel deal or the Israel-UAE deal. But we also understand that the details of these deals are coming out and it will take time. Leaving this part also aside, an interesting thing which we find in the Indo-US relations is that Obama did not have much, and this is my view, President Obama did not have much, I should say, too much apprehensive concern towards the Pax Americana bloc, which is ASEAN countries like Japan. India has been non-aligned for a long time. Still, it's trying to get out of the non-alignment, in my view. So what now has happened is, unfortunately or fortunately, due to the fact that coronavirus is there and China has its own hostility and various border disputes so far, including the South China Sea issue, what has happened is that the Quad, which was just founded by, I think, Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister of Japan, is now something which is becoming a necessity for a non-aligned India. And that is also a fact that, yes, the Modi government is doing something, the Indian government is doing. But while the Quad is becoming a necessity, and there's also a very bigger chance that the Trump administration really needs to gear up some multilateral alliances, which might or might not be possible. It's just like, because Asian politics or Asian geopolitics is not binary, it's not that easy to do. So it's not Europe, it's not the Soviets, it's not like that, it's not even Africa. So multilateralism is somewhere down the line, at least in military partnerships, not possible for now. So this election can actually reflect some things like the Democrats still have not, unfortunately, changed, although some of them have very good stances, like Vice President Biden, for that matter. Vice President Biden, former Vice President Biden. I would say, okay, I think Datish suggested that Susan Rice might be the Secretary of State if she joins, presumably. Then a very interesting take would be there to understand that if Democrats join, then how will they wield the principles and understandings of multilateralism? Because that is also related with the Pax Americana idea of what America really is. Trump is a disruptor, he's a revisionist. Like Boris Johnson, like Jair Bolsonaro, like all the center right, or for that matter, conservative politicians, or even if they're traditionalists. So my simple take is that it's a very unpredictable election. But at the same time, the thing is that maybe the diaspora might think it still is uncertain, might think that a president and an administration which focuses on change, and a change which might be disruptive but still is incremental, revisionist, and helpful for both India and the US, might be the person who would be voted. So this is my view. With regards to Senate and all, I think the situation might be different, depends on the counties, depends on the districts. So that is it from my side. Thank you, Master.
Thank you. So I would just now like to highlight that until now we have covered a large issues considering Quad or the Chinese ambitions, etc. So coming to next theme, and I will quickly coming to that since we are short on time, very short on time. So initially we had talked about convergence and strategic relations and how would that impact the Indian diaspora. So shifting from US, I would like to now shift the theme of discussion about Indian diaspora and how the strategic role which it would play for cooperation and convergence between India and Australia. So for that, I would request Ishani ma'am to just provide her inputs about Indian diaspora in Australia and her views about the same. Ishani ma'am, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So, in the context of Australia, what I have to say, I mean, given some of the reporting which I have done and interaction that I've had, is that the Indian diaspora in Australia is not yet ready to take on any kind of political role or a role in public life. Like last year in the 2019 elections, which I had actually covered, there were some candidates of Indian origin, and a couple of them who were somewhat high profile. But unfortunately, none of them really won their seats. And so, as far as government goes, we don't have practically any representation there. I think the Indians in Australia are more professional people who are, doing their jobs and, want to get ahead professionally. And it may be sometime they are engaging at grassroots level. For instance, in this after the COVID pandemic started, in certain cities in Sydney and Melbourne, the Indian community got together and helped other people who were in distress, not just community members, but they ran food kitchens and so on. But as far as significant political role, I don't think they are yet there. I mean, there have been people in the past who have sort of been elected to local offices, etc. But to make any difference to in Indo-Australian sort of relations, I don't think we are there yet. That's my that's my opinion. I mean, I would love to hear from the others what they feel about it.
Uh, Dr. Mishra, would you like to contribute or just add your thoughts to this?
Yeah, I think it was largely laid out very clearly by Shani. But I would just concur with her that we're not quite there yet in terms of our uh, influencing ability in terms of electoral politics in Australia. But gradually, the number of students in Australia is gradually rising rapidly, and you see in the last at least in the last 5 years a vigorous PR being done by Australian embassies, even consulates in Calcutta, for instance, which was experienced by me firsthand. I think there has been a lot of wooing going on. Gradually, the number of Indians in Australia has today, I don't have the figures, but I think it's really there. But in terms of influencing electoral politics, not quite there. Thank you.
Uh, uh, Professor Parulekar or Sylvia, would you like to further add about? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just basically join Ishani ji and Dr. Vivek in saying that, I mean, they're so right. Because obviously you have to look at also how these countries attract, diasporas to them. So, for example, Australia has always been a place that's kind of presented itself as the other land of opportunity. It's obviously a country with more than 110 different ethnicities who live there. So it's really a case of like a multicultural kind of a setting without necessarily being the American kind of melting pot where everyone just becomes American. In Australia, you still remain your own kind of Australian. But the point is obviously the kind of role that Indians have been playing in medical diplomacy. I mean, just in Melbourne alone, I believe 25% of Melbourne's doctors, MBBS doctors, are Indians. And they often say that there is hardly a lane in many of these cities where you don't cross through a lane without seeing probably some Indian name with a kind of a medical sign above it. So this kind of a role that Indians have been playing. It's also important to realize that before 2014, the level of engagement at the political level between India and Australia was virtually non-existent in terms of bilateral visits. In fact, Prime Minister Modi broke that huge hiatus that existed. And since then, we have seen a kind of a sustained political engagement through different prime ministers in Australia we've had. It's also important that when Australia and India look at each other, they don't look at each other essentially as political entities. They have looked at each other in terms of the soft power angles. When you look at the soft power angle, you see a very, very high quotient of India-Australia engagement, whether it's through cricket, whether it's through food, whether it's through Bollywood. Those kind of idioms play more strongly in the India-Australia relationship rather than the political stakeholding, which obviously would take a lot more time because Indians normally are seen as people who like to get their feet firmly entrenched before they could get into any kind of political, ambitioning or kite flying of any kind. Thank you.
I would quickly jump in. I think over the last couple of years, what India and Australia has rightly been able to do is diversify its bilateral relations, which is extremely important, right? Because for a very long period of time, there was only political engagement on like more on strategic issues, but lesser on like building economic ties. So the fact that India has been able to do so with Australia, that really speaks to also the upgrading of India Australia relations to comprehensive strategic partnership between the two countries. One aspect which I think India and Australia is or also is driving closer coming together of both the countries is apprehensions about China's unilateral assertive policies in the Indo-Pacific, which has also led to deepening of cooperation between India and Australia in the Indo-Pacific, and both the countries are doing a lot in terms of also maritime cybersecurity issues. They recently have signed a logistic supports agreement in the maritime domain. So there are a lot of strategic convergences that are afoot. However, if it's more substantiated by a broadening to it, should also receive a lot of spotlight and attention, as in how we develop bilateral ties in the future.
Thank you very
Thank you
much,
very much,
Sylvia.
Sylvia.
So,
So,
after
after
hearing
hearing
from all
from
of the
all of the
speakers,
speakers,
uh, we
we
can
can
certainly
certainly
say
say
that
that
India
India
needs to work further to broaden it, to further explore avenues of convergence, considering Indian diaspora in Australia as well as considering trade or many other such avenues, such as it can be maybe blue economy or underwater domain awareness, so that many secondary avenues are explored and identified through which a long-term relation and strategic relation can be sustained between India and Australia. So, as we have crossed our time, so I would just like to conclude the discussion now. And first of all, I would like to thank all the speakers for their valuable time and providing their valuable inputs to the theme of the discussion. Certain certain inputs or certain key takeaways from this discussion, which I could identify, are we need more and more uh, more and more young researchers to study and further assess Indian diaspora to further identify and explore avenues, not only avenues, but also we need more civil societies and more organizations, as stated by Sylvia Mishra, which could conduct and carry on people to people dialogues. And certainly, as Professor Parulekar had mentioned about medical diplomacy, India is certainly pharmacy of the world, and it exports. It is largest exporter of generic medicines. We can use this in pharmaceutical base, the pharmaceutical base in India, and also we could combine it with the private healthcare sector and consolidate a proper medical diplomacy, not only towards Indo-Pacific region but also further escalate it in different regions of the world. So towards towards end of the session, I would really thank our speakers, our participants who have joined, and also the viewers who have joined us through YouTube editorials. And thank you, speakers, for your valuable time and inputs.